Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, I'm Kerrie Machin. I'll be presenting today. Thank you for joining. Just a couple of minutes to go before the advertised start, so we'll give some of the participants or the registered participants time to join. But I wanted to join now just to let you know you're in the right place and that we will be getting underway in just a couple of moments. In the meantime, I'm going to start sharing the slide deck, which hopefully you will all be able to see in just a tick. There we go. Okay, so just another minute or two and then we will get underway. I will be getting underway promptly because there's a fair amount to get through today on today's agenda. Okay, so hello and welcome to the session today, Legal Sector Under Cyber Siege, How to Avoid a Disaster. I'm Kerrie Machin. I'm one of the directors here at Mitigo Cyber Risk Management. As many of you will know, we are the partner to the Law Society. We also are strategic partners to the Law Society of Scotland, and also we partner with the Bar Council. So the legal sector is one of our specialisms, and we work with well over 100 firms in the sector in order to help them identify and control their cyber risk. Amongst other things, unfortunately, we also deal with breaches. So sometimes companies come to us where they're already have had a problem, and then we have to do the forensic work to try and undo the issue that's just occurred. Not something you really want to get involved with. However, unfortunately, what we're seeing still within the sector is an increasing amount of successful cyber breaches because attacks are happening all the time, and the aim of today is to present you with information about who's doing this, what it looks like if it happens to you, and I guess towards the end we'll be looking at what are the things that you can do about this, and address some of the common misconceptions, because I think one of the reasons that we see so many firms getting breached is because they are taking action, they are doing things, and plenty of people on here today will be sitting there saying, I'm spending money on technical products recommended by my IT firm, and yet I'm still not sure whether I'm secure or not. And as I say, I'll address those issues as we go through today. It's only a half an hour session. I'm going to try and leave a little bit of time for a Q&A at the end. The Q&A will be done via the Q&A option, which so you can type them in there towards the top of your screen, if your screen looks like mine. So if you can type any questions in that you've got, and I'll try to my best to answer at the end. By the way, if I don't get around to it, I will still try to send you a response after the session. And just by way of housekeeping, those that have attended today, we will be providing you with a link to the deck and the recording afterwards. So let's get on with the show, as I say, because there's an awful lot of content that I'm trying to pack in. If I run a few minutes over, hopefully A, you'll forgive me, and B, you'll be able to stick with us. So topics today I've kind of gone through already, so let's jump ahead. Let's just look at some statistics to give ourselves a flavour of what's going on in the cybercrime world. So every year the UK government carry out a cyber breach survey, and the results of this year, I've taken some of the salient points from it, but over 8.5 million cyber crimes are known within the UK for 2024. So that's an increase up from 7.78 million in 2023. 612,000 businesses reported a cyber breach in 2024. There will be a lot more businesses that were victims because they chose not to report that breach, but it's a significant number, and there will have been a significant number within the legal sector as part of that. Just to give you a flavour, about 3 to 4 weeks is the average downtime of any ransomware attack. And I'll be talking a bit more about ransomware attacks in a moment. And it may surprise you, I was carrying out a poll with some people last week, and I said, what do you think the average ransomware payment is? And people were sitting there saying, oh, you know, maybe 20, 30, 40, 50,000 pounds. The average ransomware payment in 2024, this is according to the National Crime Agency, was actually £1.5 million. And you may sit there saying, well, you know, how and why do people pay that amount of money? Well, if you think about it, if you were to be down for 3 or 4 weeks or longer, you consider the, I know it's not the legal sector, but you consider the Marks and Spencer's cyber breach that's happened recently, and the impact of that. You know, some people would sit there and say it's a small price to pay versus the actual cost of the breach if you were to let it run on. And also remember, you know, criminals command such numbers because they've been in your systems. They know what you're worth. They know what insurance policies you have. They know how much money you have in the bank. So, you know, it's a huge business model, and they make an awful lot of money across the whole of the world. But here I think are two of the most worrying statistics that I can share with you. The first is that 83% of businesses have not carried out a cybersecurity vulnerability audit or risk assessment, if you prefer, and around just, you know, a similar amount have no formal incident response plan. And of course, if you are the victim of a cyber crime or a cyber breach, then you will need to have an incident response plan. And I can promise you that you do not want to make this up in the process of being attacked and breached. It's something that you need to have put together, and then you need to be testing that regularly. But moving on, I have put some high-profile breaches. I accept that they're not within the legal sector, but we're seeing an awful lot of stuff at the moment. And interestingly, when I get onto who's carrying out these attacks, it'll shed a little bit more light as to how easy it is now to become a cyber criminal. The barrier to entry is much lower than it used to be. You know, you don't need to be anywhere near as technical, because there are companies out there, you know, selling or licensing software or ransomware as a service, RAS as we call it, in order to allow that to happen. But you know, most of you probably shop in M&S or can't use their online platform at the moment, but they anticipate that profits are going to be impacted by £300 million, which is fairly significant. You know, the Co-op, again, if you look at that, Scattered Spider were the group that carried it out. We've just seen some arrests made. I think it was last week, using the Dragon Force RAS. You know, so that's the same type of ransomware as the software that was used, and the same group doing it. And then we've seen Adidas that was thought to be using the same. And obviously we've seen Cartier, North Face and Victoria's Secret also, you know, being victims of an attack. And whilst these are high profile, and some of you might sit there and say, well, you know, that's not us. We're not going to be targeted in the same way. One of the misconceptions here is that just because you're not a high profile company or you're not a big company can reduce the chances of it happening to you. And I think if you fall into that camp, I'm here to tell you it's not the case. Cyber criminals generally target, I'm not saying they don't target organizations, but typically they target vulnerability. Therefore, if you have a vulnerability and they find it and they get in, then they can work out what you're worth and what they can effectively take you for, if that's not too cheap a phrase, but that's kind of how it works. But that's the high profile stuff we read about in the news. If we look at it from the ICO's perspective, we saw DPP, a Merseyside-based law firm, fined earlier this year £60,000. So a fairly small penalty compared to others that we've seen issued by the ICO, but I guess that adds insult to injury, doesn't it? If you've been the victim of a ransomware attack, as DPP were, and you know the disruption that would have caused internally, and then also you know the reputational damage that most likely had, to then be scrutinised by the regulator, by the ICO, and then fined 60,000 is something else that you probably don't really want to be spending time and money dealing with. The ICO are urging organisations to do more to combat the growing threat of cyber attacks. And again, one of the things we're finding is firms just don't know where to turn. As to what is it we should be doing, what does good look like, and that's one of the jobs that Mitigo carry out for its clients, is to say this is what good looks like, this is what you need to be doing, and if in fact that takes the guesswork away. And I think a lot of firms out there are doing their best, but I find sometimes they're being guided by perhaps their IT provider who are not cyber security experts, and literally it's just a best guess. It's not really identifying the risk properly, and therefore if you can't identify that risk properly, you can't control it. And that's where I think some of the some of the worry comes and concern comes from firms. Also, Tucker's solicitors were also fined a couple of years ago now, but they were fined £98,000 as a result of a ransomware attack as well. So it's costly. You are going to be scrutinised. You are going to be fined, or you're likely to be fined if you're found to be negligent in these areas. What I think helps people is for us to understand who's behind cybercrime. I've got there's an ecosystem effectively, and it's a very sophisticated and complex industry, if you like. And I think some of us perhaps sit there thinking this is just as the picture indicates there. It could just be that they're, kids in hoodies carrying out these attacks from their bedrooms. And, sometimes that is the case. But actually, as we go through this, you'll see that there's far more to it. So, as I say, there's 4 groups I'm going to go through here on this ecosystem. They might not all be included in every type of cyber breach that we see, but they do make up the ecosystem. So effectively what stealers do is steal your credentials and then sell it on to other cyber criminals. So your credentials might be your username, your email address is typically what that would be, and then things like passwords. And just to give you an example of how fraught this is, how wide ranging this is, back in February this year, 23 billion rolls of stealer logs were obtained from a Telegram channel known as Alien Tech Space. It doesn't matter where that's come from, but effectively 23 billion rows, and the data contained 284 million unique email addresses alongside the password. So the stealers have got that information and they sell that on then to if you like, the next part of the chain. And the next part of that ecosystem tends to be what we call initial access brokers. And so what these brokers do is they then use some of that information. There are other things they can do as well, other methods of entry, but using stolen credentials is pretty rife. They can evade your antivirus systems the same way that the stealers can. So if you're sitting there thinking, well, I've got endpoint protection or I've got antivirus, bear in mind these guys know how to work around them. And therefore, that's why cyber risk management in its full essence is a multifaceted, layered approach. You have to have lots of different things. You can't just be relying on things like your antivirus, because what's the job of a cyber criminal is to work out how to get around your defenses. So what these access brokers do is they evade your systems, gain access into the system, and then look at what you're worth. How much can I make from you? We've already said the average payment last year was £1.5 million, and they'll sell that lead then onto the next part of the ecosystem. And just to sort of bring that home again, here is an advert based out on the dark web, where one of the initial access brokers was selling. They've gained access into a system. So this was an American firm that they've got into. They've got an RDP, so a remote desktop. Those that use remote desktop will know what that means. But effectively, they've said, right, the company, the revenue is $64 million a year. They're in construction. There's 139 staff. And I've got domain admin rights, and effectively it's £3,000 for the lead. So effectively they're just selling the lead on to the next level of cyber criminal, as you can see there. What we then see is 2 different types of criminals then that start to get involved to actually carry out the breach and the attack, the ransomware attack. And what I've put up next is the ransomware gang, who will develop the ransomware as a service product. So this is a piece of malware or very clever software, which when laid out into your networks and your systems, it will encrypt systems, but it will also help the criminals to exfiltrate your data. And what the ransomware gangs do, typically they would, in the past, they would have carried out the attack themselves. But what we're starting to see now is that they license that software out to what we call affiliates. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the barrier to entry is now lower because those affiliates are not having to develop the malware. They don't have to have as much technical skill. And when you can rely on the other people within that ecosystem to effectively get you into a system, a network, and then use and utilize the ransomware as a service, then life becomes a lot easier for them, a lot more simple. And that's why over time we're seeing so many more issues and successful cyber breaches. But effectively what these affiliates are going to do is, as it says there, extend the compromise, deliver the ransomware, and then they cover their tracks. We saw with one of the recent attacks of DPP, the fine that I saw, what was stipulated by the ICO is that the threat actors, once they finished their attack and exfiltrated the data, they used antiviruses of their own within the system to tidy it up, which made the forensics very difficult to work out what had gone on and what data had been taken. There were other things as well, but as you can see, they're very clever at covering their tracks also. So what are the common types of cyber threats? You know, I've been talking about ransomware so far, and I'm going to dwell on that in just a moment. But there are different types of attacks, and I suppose we don't need to know what they all are, but there's business email compromise, which by volume is the biggest type of cybercrime we see, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. We all know what phishing is. Phishing tends to lead to ransomware and business email compromise, but we see denial of service attacks, so DDoS attacks, which stop you getting into your systems. We see man-in-the-middle attacks. We see SQL injection, and you might say, well, what's that? If you've got a platform or a portal and you've got your own code, they can inject into that code as well, so compromise it. And then we see other things called zero-day exploits, which are criminals exploiting known vulnerabilities within software. That's the reason why you have to patch and patch quickly. And when a patch is announced by a software provider, you really should put that patch in place immediately, because the cyber criminals can exploit that unless you do that. Moving on to ransomware. I appreciate I'm moving at pace today. As I said, there's quite a fun-packed agenda. But so ransomware is the thing that we hear about the most. That's, you know, when we touch on those high-profile attacks. But let's just consider what this looks like, what it feels like, what it's going to be about. So typically there are two outcomes to this. The first is they're going to look to deny you access into your systems. So if you're a law firm out there with 10, 20, 30, 50 fee earners, imagine the impact of not being able to access your client data to be able to carry on the job that you're doing. Imagine you then being down for 3 or 4 weeks and the disruption that that's going to cause within your organization. That is the purpose of the ransomware attack when it comes to denying you access to those systems. And that's where you have to think about, well, is it cheaper for me to pay the ransom or is it not? But it could be that you've got backups that would get you out of that encryption. And so the second thing that the criminals tend to do is to steal your data and hold that to ransom as well. And in fact, I would suggest that that's more prevalent now than just the encryption of your systems. But the fact and the purpose of the malware here is to do both. And so, you know, you've got to ensure that it's going to be difficult for them to come in and encrypt you. You're going to have decent backups just in case that does happen. And by the way, we see an awful lot of backups fail during a ransomware attack, because the criminals try to take that out and are often very successful at doing so. But as I say, taking your extremely confidential client information is the bit that probably sends the shudder through most people. What would it look like? So one of the most famous gangs out there is the Lockbit gang. They're into their third version of Lockbit, because remember, cyber criminals tend to hang out on the dark web, and apart from last week where we actually saw a gang getting arrested, we don't really see that very often. So what happens is their website on the dark web will be taken down by someone like the FBI, or it'll be someone like Interpol, where they've managed to do that, and our authorities get involved with that quite a lot. But because they don't catch the criminals then just pop up elsewhere in a different guise. So as I say, Lockbit Black are in their third guise at the moment. And if we go across to this screen, you can see there's a screenshot there from Lockbit 2, so the previous incarnation, as it were. And what this is on the left-hand side is if you were the victim of a cyber breach and they've taken your data, what they will do is give you a link to go onto the dark web to take you to their website. And each of these 9 squares on the left-hand side are countdown clocks, where effectively they're saying to those firms, you've got until this clock runs to 0 to pay us, otherwise we will leak your data. And so that again is something that would make many people concerned. And just to sort of prove their sophistication again, on the right hand side here, what you can see is their live. This is a different group of threat actors. This was Hive, and this is their live chat department. Because remember, if they want to extort you for cash, they want to make life easy for you. Most of it's paid in Bitcoin, but they want to make sure that they get their money and make it easy for you to pay it. So those are kind of the process that you would go through. What you will see typically is some form of proof of hack. So they will leak a little bit of your data out onto the dark web. This is actual data from law firms back in late 2023 from part of the CTS breach. CTS were the IT MSP that were breached, but quite a lot of their clients who were hosting documents within their cloud unfortunately had a lot of their data compromised as part of it. So they'll leak a little bit out. And I guess I put this on screen, unless this happens to you as a firm, you don't fully perhaps understand the impact of it and how it would make you feel. And I think trying to sort of say to you, look, imagine this was your data, your client data, and the criminals had reached out to you, and there's a countdown clock, and here's some of the data that we've taken. All of a sudden that starts to put into context, the severity and importance of what's just happened. So the consequences of ransomware, I think, are fairly obvious. We've already talked about downtime. What I would say is, whilst the average downtime is 3 or 4 weeks, actually it's months of recovery, because your systems aren't going to come back up in the same way that they previously did because of the way that these attacks manifest themselves. So, it's not uncommon for us to see firms still reeling and feeling the impact of it and slowing them down from an operational perspective for 6-9 months. That's just not unusual. Clearly there's going to be financial loss as part of this, because you've got to pay the ransom, you've got to pay companies like us to come in and help you work out A, what the problem is, and B, then fix it, stop it from happening again. And that's where you need to start undertaking risk assessments that you should have already done in order to try and mitigate these problems. Reputation is obviously an issue here. Your clients, some of you will have commercial clients. Yes, some of you will have domestic clients as well. But reputationally, if someone feels that you're not looking after them in the way that you're supposed to, then there's a chance that they will also look to leave you. And of course, I've just shown you earlier in this presentation, that the information is publicized and made available for people to be able to read for themselves. So it's not particularly pleasant, to be honest. Obviously, there's going to be regulatory penalties either from the SRA or the ICO. And of course, it could be that you face lawsuits yourself from clients if you lose their data. And of course, your costs are going to go up, because you're going to have to, if you're paying insurance premiums, those are going to go up, and you're going to have to improve your security posture as well. So that's ransomware, and as I say, that's the bit that we all read about, the M&S stuff and the co-op stuff. We read about that, but actually within the legal sector, and I told you that we work extensively throughout the sector, it's actually business email compromise, which we see as the #1 attack type, and by volume, it's far, far, far more. Why? Well, because everybody's always working on their emails every day. I imagine the first thing that most of you will do after this session, you might go and have lunch, but you probably check your emails, and we're reliant on them fully. And so what criminals do is they target email systems, be that or your email system or even through your supply chain. And the supply chain is a major cause of cybercrime, because what happens is you get an email from, let's say, another firm that you're liaising with. You're expecting information to come from them, an email, and then of course, why wouldn't you open that email? But those emails then might have links within them, and unfortunately it leads them to be able to start targeting your clients and looking at putting fake invoices in there. So if you look at, let's say, a commercial transaction or a conveyancing transaction where your client is expecting to receive some form of instruction from you to pay an amount of money, and we've seen hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds at a time paid by this method. They've got into your email, they send an email from your account as you, so your client wouldn't expect, they're thinking, well, it's come from the lawyer. They get the invoice, it puts the bank details, which unfortunately are not yours, and it tricks them into making the payment. And we just see that so often as part of what we see here within the legal sector. So payment diversion is the top consequence here, and as I say, we just see it all the time, unfortunately. But ransomware attacks can be part of this as well, because they're going to get into your system. They can start to move then laterally within that system. So it could be that they can take other data, or they can reach parts of your network which allow them to take you down, as it were, and then hold you to task, hold you to ransom over it. And then, of course, what they might also do is then send emails onto all of your contacts. If they're in your email system, they might as well spread the virus, if you like. And we see that an awful lot. And again, that's kind of that supply chain thing. So what are the common errors that we see firms making here? Right, the first one, and it's the top one, is that you believe that your IT are dealing with cybersecurity. That sounds controversial, perhaps. Your IT provider, be that internally or externally, will have some form of cybersecurity software, endpoint protection, and whatever, and various protocols, firewalls, antiviruses, whatever, multi-factor authentication. I accept that. But IT are there for functionality and will put some security in. Proper cyber risk management comes from talking to people that do it every day, that understand how cyber criminals work, understanding what your risk is, going further, understanding what your regulatory and legal requirements are here. And that isn't IT. And I think the #1 reason why we see firms breached is because they're lulled into a false sense of security, thinking that I'm secure and I'm okay, aren't I? And I pay quite a lot of money for some of these things. And yet they get the breach, and that kind of adds insult to injury again. So that's failing to gain independent assurance. Independent assurance is obviously from people so that your IT shouldn't be marking their own homework, and from people that know what they're doing with the right expertise. I touched on it, point 3 earlier. If you think you're too small to be a target, we've dealt with firms in the single digits with employee numbers all the way up to hundreds and thousands. So you're never too small to be a target. You're never too big. If you work in a hosted environment, you're no safer. You need to understand your risk profile. If you work in the cloud and think that makes you safer than being on servers, I'm afraid it's a different risk profile. You still need to understand how that works. If email account takeover relies on the 365 being infiltrated, remember that's a cloud product. So that just tells you that that's where the issues are. If you've got cyber essentials, it's a starting point, but it doesn't provide you with sufficient comprehensive security, certainly not in the legal sector. If you're carrying out penetration testing, it's a good thing to do, but it isn't holistic. It doesn't look at the whole organization, so that could leave you with unidentified risk. And of course, if you've only got cyber insurance, remember, really, the horse is bolted if you're relying on that. It's the bit that you do before that so that the insurance policy doesn't have to kick in. But fundamentally, the reason that firms get get infiltrated by cyber criminals is because they fail to understand their risk. And if you fail to understand your risk, you've got no chance of controlling it. From a regulatory and legal and moral perspective, the SRA expect you under the Code of Conduct. I'll leave those numbers on there. You can read yourself, but they expect you to, have the right controls in place, carry out the right assessments. Under GDPR, you are required to conduct a risk assessment, implement effective controls. And note there, it's not just around technology, it's around people, technology, and governance. You have to have all of these things in place. We see a lot of firms falling down in, certainly in the people area and the governance area, because people just see this as a technical solution, and it's not. Cyber risk is far wider than that. You have to understand business process, you have to understand behavior, and then you have to have policy and governance that drives it through. And you have to have a regime of testing. It isn't a one-off thing. You have to make sure, because criminals change the way they work, you change the way you work, and therefore you need to, it's an ongoing process. You've just got to keep doing it and have evidence. By the way, if you haven't got evidence and you come under scrutiny from the ICO, they'll just sit there and say, well, you didn't do it. And of course, you've got moral and commercial obligations there around protecting your business, your staff, and your clients. One of the big things that I've seen, and I appreciate we're running quickly towards the end here, but the government have just issued in April the Cyber Governance Code of Practice, which is a code. It's a voluntary code, but it's very important because the ICO will take this into account in any judgments that they look at. And what it does is it formalizes the government's expectations regarding an organization's governance of cyber security, and sets out clear actions that directors, so partners, senior partners, need to take to meet their responsibilities in managing cyber risk. And the reason that they've issued this code of practice is because they've recognized too many businesses are leaving this to their IT firms, and they're saying, no, if you run an organization, if you run a business, it's your responsibility to make sure that you've got the right controls in place here, the right strategies, because you haven't got the right oversight. And there is a clear demand from industry that they want to know what good looks like. This is now putting that onus on you. So, they've also turned around and said, by the way, that the code could be the step prior to legislation. So if you haven't seen the code, we have carried out done some webinars on it, but I'd be happy to talk to you about it as well. But to give you a little bit of information about that, and I'll move on from the voluntary bit because I kind of covered that a moment ago. There are 5 themes to this code: risk management, cyber strategy, people, incident planning and response, and oversight and assurance. All themes that I've been talking about as we go through this webinar. And it's a fairly hefty document, and it does put quite a big onus on you to do it. But again, you can get help, and we can help you with that. So just moving on a bit, and as I say, I know I've had to move at pace, but what can you do? Well, the first piece of, I guess, guidance or advice that I would give you, the first and last, is the one at the top and the one at the bottom. The first is stop hoping that you're secure and start proving. If you haven't carried out any form of independent cyber risk assessment, then, are you hoping that you're secure, or should you really start proving that? And the bit at the bottom is stop relying on your IT provider for cyber risk management. And I'm not bad mouthing IT providers. We work with some great IT companies when we're working alongside our clients, but their job is different to ours, as I've already alluded to. So there's a list of things there that I'm not going to list out, because you can all read, and you're all going to have access to these slides afterwards. But I think what it demonstrates, hopefully I've demonstrated just in this quick session, is it's complex. There's an awful lot of things that you need to think about when it comes to understanding your risk, controlling your risk, and unfortunately we've seen too many firms that are falling foul because they're just failing to do that. I've put this slide on there because obviously some of you might want to reach out and have a chat, because we can help. By the way, it's free to talk to us initially. Yes, we have a price for our service, as do you, but reach out if you want to have a chat, and we'll talk to you about what we do to help firms that look just like you, and the things that we do to help them. So I'll take that away now, and I can see that I think I can see that there's some questions coming on the Q&A. So I'll just carry on for a little bit longer, and then we'll call it to order, because I have run over. So let's have a look at this question here. We no longer use servers. Everything is cloud-based with 100% reliance on Microsoft and cloud-based accounts, case management, leap, it says there, including secure passwords, 2FA. I am not sure what more we can do in practice should these platforms be compromised by a ransomware attack. Right, that's just the case in point. So the first thing is, you've got a Microsoft account. Thinking that Microsoft are going to be infiltrated or compromised is unlikely, because they spend so much money on security from the back end. But you are responsible for the front door, i.e. the people that are using your technology, the technology that then connects to it, the laptops, the phones, the iPads, whatever it be, and the desktops and all of those things. If you allow entry through that front door, the criminals then can get into those systems, and then they can have at it. And it then depends on whether you've set up those platforms with the right alerts and with the right configuration to help prevent the criminals doing what they want to do. And fundamentally, that's what we do for our clients, is we sit there and say, let's understand what your people look like from a behavioral perspective and your business processes. Let's understand what devices you use and whether you're opening the front door to the criminals. Let's look out onto the wider internet and see how easy it would be to get into your cloud products and platforms. And then we can work with you and your IT firm to put the right configuration changes in, the right policies. Remember, I said you can't control all of this with tech. Some of this is about saying to your people, I don't want you to work like this. I need you to work like this because it's a safer way of doing it. The more we can control with tech, obviously, the better, because then you're automating protection. But it just doesn't work that way. But if I leave you with nothing else today, and I am going to draw it to an end because I've run 5 minutes over, is if you haven't carried out a cyber risk assessment, I implore you to do so. Be that with us or be that with somebody else. Do yourself a favor, understand your risk, and then you can go a whole way to being able to control that. So I apologize that I've gone at pace. Maybe it's refreshing that somebody does, but I thank you for joining today. We'll be trying to host some more of these through the year, but thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Goodbye now.